I sat at the bar, nursing my drink, feeling the usual blend of annoyance and boredom that came with being roped into these things by my friends. They'd set me up on this date, no doubt thinking it was some grand idea, but I could already feel it. This was going to be one of those nights I'd spend checking my watch every 5 minutes. The coaster under my beer had started to give up on life. Cardboard edges soaked through, curling at the sides, the pulp turning gray. The wet ring under my glass spread across the varnished wood like a cheap promise I'd made to myself. I slid the mess aside with 2 fingers and checked my watch again. The bar was dead quiet, except for the faint hum of the fridge behind the counter. The air was thick with stale beer and lemon cleaner, an odd mix that hung in the tin ceiling echoes. I kept telling myself that Banks, one of my so-called friends, had to be setting me up for a laugh. It wasn't the first time. A few minutes dragged by, and I thought about slipping out. Who needed this? But just as I was about to grab my jacket, the door opened. She walked in like she owned the place. I can't explain it. You know that feeling when someone walks in and you don't just see them, you feel them? That's what it was. She was dressed in black, hair loose, eyes sharp like she had somewhere important to be, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. Her gaze swept across the room and locked with mine before I even realized I was staring. She walked right up to the bar, casual, collected, but there was something about the way she moved, the slight tension in her shoulders that made me second-guess the entire situation. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off. She looked perfect, but I spotted the primer smear on her wrist and the faintest tape line on her finger. A workday gone wrong, or a badge of honor, I couldn't decide. Then she was in front of me, and I felt it. I had to stop checking my watch, had to pull myself together, because this wasn't just another blind date. This was something else. She reached her hand out to shake mine. "Adeline," she said, her voice clear, warm, but with an edge, like she wasn't here for games. The name didn't hit me at first, but there was something about the way she said it that made the room feel smaller. "I know this isn't what you expected, but I have something to discuss." I blinked, not sure if I was more thrown off by the sudden intimacy of the handshake or her directness. I swallowed, nodding like a moron. "Sawyer," I said, clearing my throat. "I think we were set up by Banks, I know," she interrupted, the corners of her mouth twitching up just slightly. "I don't think this is a date, though. More like an emergency." I raised an eyebrow, my curiosity suddenly piqued. "Emergency?" "Hudson Hall," she said, and the weight of those 2 words made my stomach tighten. "I've got 6 weeks to fix a major issue with the building, or the loan gets called, and everything I've invested in it goes up in smoke." The casual tone in her voice didn't match the urgency in her eyes. The kind of eyes that told you she wasn't someone who made mistakes. And that's when I realized this wasn't some random setup. She wasn't here to flirt or waste time. She was here because she needed something, and I wasn't sure yet if I was ready to give it to her. But when she pulled out a crumpled blueprint, the lines drawn sharp and frantic with notes, I knew there was more to her than just a beautiful face. "You're an engineer, right?" she asked, sliding the blueprint in front of me. The paper was creased and smudged, but the clarity of her purpose wasn't lost on me. "You take a look. Tell me if it's fixable." I stared at the plans, trying to process the situation. I wasn't just some random guy in a bar anymore. I was the lifeline to something that mattered to her, something that had the potential to fall apart in 6 weeks. I glanced up at her, eyes meeting hers for the first time since she'd walked in. There was no hesitation, no pretension, just raw honesty in those eyes. She wasn't asking for help because she thought I'd be the knight in shining armor. She was asking because she didn't have another choice. I exhaled through my nose, my hands sliding over the blueprint like I was reading a map. "We'll need to shore up the roof," I said, taking charge. "But the rest of this..." I flipped the paper over, tracing a few key points with my pen. "It's not going to be easy, and it's going to cost more than you think." She didn't flinch, not one bit. "I'll find a way," she said simply. Her voice was steady, but there was something in the way she spoke that told me she wouldn't let the building, or herself, fall apart. I didn't know yet why, but I was starting to wonder how much of a role I'd play in fixing it all. And that smile of hers? Yeah, it lingered. It didn't just vanish when she pulled back. It stayed with me, curling up at the edges of my thoughts, the kind of smile that made me second-guess everything I thought I knew about this night. I picked up my pen. All right, let's get to work. And just like that, the night took a turn I wasn't expecting. I thought I had it figured out. The job at Hudson Hall was supposed to be straightforward. I'd been hired to consult, come in, take a look, do some quick assessments, and leave. That's what I expected. But as soon as I stepped onto the site with Adeline the next morning, I realized just how wrong I was. Hudson Hall wasn't just any building. It was a piece of history, and from the moment I walked through those doors, I could feel it. The scent of old timber and rusted iron, the soft creak of the floors under my boots, it all whispered stories of a past I'd never been a part of. The sunlight, streaming through high, clear-story windows, hit the dust in the air like it didn't want to settle. The building had a pulse. It was alive with age and secrets, but it was also dying. Adeline led the way, her boots clicking against the floor as she walked, her back straight, eyes scanning the space. She moved with purpose, like every step had a reason behind it. When we reached the north wall, she didn't say anything at first. She just pointed. "This is where it starts," she said, her voice low but strong. "Every time a truck hits the road out front, the plaster cracks more. We've patched it 1,000 times, but it keeps coming back." I pressed my palm against the cold brick, feeling the dampness in the mortar joints. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to hear what the building was telling me. The hum was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. A low vibration that ran through the structure like an urgent whisper. It wasn't just settling, it was something worse. I opened my eyes and nodded. "It's not the wall," I said, looking up. "It's the trusses." Adeline followed my gaze to the ceiling, where thick timber beams ran across. Iron shoes at the bearing points, a beautiful structure made with care, back when men still measured beams with pride and prayer. But now I could see it. The rust, the corrosion, the iron was failing, slowly but surely. She didn't want to hear it. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, in the way she folded her arms, like she was trying to protect herself from the truth. "The wood's fine," she said, her voice defensive. "We sanded it." "The wood is fine," I agreed, tracing the iron with my finger. "But this?" I tapped the dark bloom of corrosion at the point where the timber met the iron. "This is what's failing. The rust is pushing, crushing the brick from the inside out." Her face drained of color as I traced the crack lines in the brick with my finger. It wasn't settling. It was a wedge, pushing the structure apart, little by little, until it couldn't hold anymore. "Can we fix it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I turned to her then, meeting her gaze. She wasn't just the owner of Hudson Hall. She was its heart and soul. She was the one who'd invested everything, her time, her energy, and her grandmother's inheritance, into keeping it alive. I could see that now. She wasn't just asking me to help because she was desperate. She was asking because she couldn't do it alone. "We can fix it," I said, "but it's going to be complicated. It's going to take time and money, and it's going to get ugly before it gets better." She nodded once, looking at the blueprint she'd brought with her. "I can handle ugly," she said. "Tell me what needs to be done." Quote. I exhaled through my nose, taking a moment to study the space. I could see it all in my head, where the load paths were failing, where the structure was shifting, where it was all on the verge of collapse. But there was something about her determination, the way she stood there, her shoulders set and her eyes unwavering, that made me want to help, made me want to get it right. "I'll charge double for weekends," I said, just to get it out there. I didn't care about the money. I cared about the job, about doing it the right way. She didn't flinch. She didn't even hesitate. "Deal." I couldn't help but respect her in that moment. She wasn't asking for a discount. She wasn't asking for a favor. She was asking me to give her everything I had, and I could tell she wasn't going to take no for an answer. And just like that, everything shifted. We spent the next few hours walking through the building, pointing out areas that needed immediate attention, areas that were more of a long-term concern. We discussed load paths, beam replacements, and how we'd shore up the roof. Adeline was sharp, precise, asking the right questions, making sure I knew she wasn't just a pretty face with a paycheck. She was in this, right alongside me, every step of the way. The more we worked, the more I realized how much she cared. This wasn't just a job to her, it was her legacy, her dream. And the more time I spent with her, the harder it was to ignore the pull I felt every time she looked at me, every time her hands brushed against mine as we worked side by side. It was the way she moved, the way she spoke, the quiet confidence she exuded that made my focus slip and my mind wander. At the end of the day, we stood outside the building, looking at the fading light, both of us covered in dust, hands dirty from the work. She was tired, I could see it, but there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there when we first started. It was like she knew we had a chance. "I've never done anything like this before," she said, her voice quiet, almost to herself. "I've never had to trust anyone with it." "I get it," I said, glancing over at her. "But I'm here, Adeline. We're gonna get this done." She looked at me then, and for a moment everything else fell away. It was just the two of us, standing there in the fading light, knowing that what we had started was bigger than either of us had expected. It wasn't just about the building anymore, it was about what we were building together. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything changed. The next few days passed in a blur of steel and sweat. Adeline and I became a team. I can't say I wasn't surprised by how well we worked together. Her focus was unwavering, her determination infectious. Every time we hit a snag, she'd roll up her sleeves and dive back in without hesitation. There was no room for doubt in her eyes, and I couldn't help but admire it. We'd been at Hudson Hall for hours every day, walking the tightrope between history and decay. The building, with its mix of faded glory and deteriorating bones, seemed to echo our every move. It felt like we were trying to breathe life into something that wanted to crumble, but we were determined to give it one last shot. One night, a little over a week into our project, we were working late, pushing through a particularly difficult part of the restoration. The air inside the hall was thick with dust, the kind that gets into your lungs and sticks there, coating everything with the weight of old years. The evening light had long since faded, leaving us with only the low hum of the work lights. Adeline was holding the plans, her brow furrowed as she inspected them, eyes scanning the pages like a hawk. I was focused on the trusses, trying to get the angles just right for the new support beams we'd be installing. I could hear her muttering under her breath, running numbers, making calculations. The same way I was. We were in sync now, no longer just a contractor and a client, but two people trying to save something important. "You good?" she asked, her voice pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced up, finding her standing near the trusses, a faint streak of dust across her cheek and her hair slightly askew, but her gaze never wavered. She was still so damn focused. "Yeah," I answered, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand, just trying to get this right. Her eyes softened for a brief second, and for a moment I saw something there, something more than just the tough, determined woman who'd been running the show. She was tired, I could see it, but she didn't let it show. It made me wonder just how much she was carrying on her shoulders, and how much of it she was trying to hide. The work didn't stop, though. We kept going, pulling the old beams out, replacing them with new ones. Every time I moved a piece of steel or timber, I felt like we were getting closer to something. Closer to fixing not just Hudson Hall, but something deeper that neither of us wanted to talk about. By the time we broke for dinner, it was already past midnight. We sat on the scaffolding, eating sandwiches and sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. Adeline was quiet, and I didn't press her for conversation. We'd been talking non-stop all day, analyzing the blueprints, discussing logistics, figuring out solutions to problems that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I could tell she was exhausted, but there was no sign of her slowing down. She kept her eyes trained on the blueprint, turning the pages like she was searching for something I couldn't see. Finally, she broke the silence. "You ever wonder what makes a place worth saving?" she asked, her voice surprisingly soft for how sharp it usually was. I paused, looking over at her. She wasn't looking at me, but rather at the rusting frame of the building, lost in thought. "I don't know," I said slowly, unsure of where she was going with this. "Why?" She looked up at me then, and there was something in her eyes, something like vulnerability that caught me off guard. "Because this place," she said, her voice steady now, "it feels like it has a heartbeat. But not everyone can see that. Not everyone gets why it matters." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the whole building seemed to breathe with us, like it was listening. "Sometimes it's not about the building itself," I said, my voice low, like I was revealing a secret I'd kept buried. "It's about what it represents, what it means to someone." I paused, watching her closely. "This place means a lot to you, doesn't it?" Quote. She nodded, looking back at the plans in her hands. "My grandmother built it," she said quietly, a soft smile touching her lips. "She used to tell me stories about this place, about how it was once the heart of the town. She loved it like it was her own child. I inherited it, but I don't know. I guess I always felt like it was my responsibility to keep it going. It's more than just a building. It's her legacy." I was quiet for a long moment, letting her words sink in. I wasn't just fixing bricks and steel here. I was fixing something that had deep roots in her life, something she'd been holding on to for years. It wasn't just about the structure, it was about the memories, the people who'd passed through it and the history it held. "I get it," I said finally. "I do." Quote. We were quiet for a long time after that, both of us lost in our thoughts, but there was something different in the air now. Something that wasn't just about the work, but about understanding. About knowing that this place, this building, was more than just a project to her. And maybe, just maybe, it was more than just a job to me too. The next few days were a blur of hard work, broken only by brief moments of conversation when we would take a break or when she'd ask for my input on something. I noticed the way she would pause when she thought I wasn't looking, checking me out in a way that I wasn't used to. The chemistry between us was undeniable, but neither of us said anything about it. Not yet. But things were changing. The building was slowly coming back to life, and so was something else, something that felt like it was buried beneath the dust and rust. The tension between us had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Every time I caught her gaze, I felt it pull me in a little more. Every time our hands brushed as we passed tools back and forth, I couldn't ignore the spark that shot through me. I'd spent my entire life in control of everything around me. Work, my career, the way I moved through the world. But Adeline, she made me want to lose control. And I couldn't decide if that was terrifying or exactly what I needed. I pushed those thoughts away and focused on the work. We still had a job to do, but every now and then, when she'd look at me with those sharp eyes, I couldn't help but wonder if the work was the only thing that needed fixing anymore. It felt like we were getting closer to something, and I couldn't quite decide if that something was the end of the project or something else entirely. Hudson Hall had started to show signs of life again. The beams were replaced, the trusses were shored up, and the foundation, though cracked in places, had been stabilized. Every morning, I walked in with the weight of the deadline looming over me, but by the time the sun began to set, I could see it. The building was coming together. So was the strange pull between me and Adeline. The tension wasn't just in the air around us. It was in every shared glance, every fleeting touch when we passed tools or reached for something at the same time. It was in the way she'd watch me when I worked, as if she was trying to figure me out, and the way I couldn't help but notice the curve of her neck as she leaned over blueprints. The attraction was there, undeniable, but neither of us had crossed the line, not yet. And then, one night, it happened. We were working late again, so late that the hall was shrouded in near-complete darkness, save for the soft, yellow glow of the temporary lights scattered around the room. It was one of those nights where the exhaustion was so deep in your bones that you couldn't even feel it anymore. My back ached, my hands were raw, and I was running on pure instinct. Adeline was just as tired, but she didn't show it. Her jaw was set, eyes determined, as she scribbled measurements on a new set of plans. I was up on the scaffolding, tightening a bolt when I heard it. The faintest sound, the creak of wood. My heart skipped a beat. In a place like Hudson Hall, those sounds were a little too familiar. The building was old, and every step felt like a warning, like a promise that one day it would finally break apart. I climbed down fast, my boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. Adeline looked up, the concern in her eyes flashing for a moment before she caught herself. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Something's off," I said, my eyes scanning the beams. "The tension in the trusses is shifting." I didn't wait for her to respond. I moved quickly, pulling the laser level out of my bag, scanning the beams once more. I needed to make sure we hadn't missed something. Adeline moved to my side, her boots clicking softly against the floor as she crouched next to me. "What are you seeing?" she asked. I was quiet for a moment, just staring at the readings. There was a slight misalignment in the south truss, a change that had happened slowly, over time. It wasn't enough to collapse the structure right away, but it was close. "This isn't good," I said, standing up and grabbing the notebook. "There's a load shift happening in the south side. If we don't address it immediately, we'll be looking at a catastrophic failure." Her eyes widened. "How bad?" Quote, "Bad," I said, "real bad." She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. I watched her face as she processed the information, her mind already moving through solutions. "We need to reinforce it now," she said. "How long?" I shook my head, frustration gnawing at my insides. "We're not going to make the inspection if we try to fix this tonight." "We need more time, Adeline." She stood up, her eyes locking onto mine, determination flashing. "We don't have time. The bank's already made it clear. We either pass inspection or they call the loan. We lose Hudson Hall." "I'm not letting that happen," I said, my voice low and firm. There was no way in hell I was walking away from this. Not now. I could see the same resolve in her eyes, the same fire. She wasn't about to lose Hudson Hall, not without a fight. We were both too deep in it now, too connected to this place, to just give up. "I'll need to reroute the load-bearing beams on the south side," I said. "But it's going to take more than just us. We need a crew. And I'll need the materials we've been waiting on." Adeline nodded, already pulling her phone from her pocket. "I'll make it happen." I watched her for a moment, admiring the way she moved. She wasn't just the general contractor here. She was the one who made things happen. The leader. The one who refused to let go, no matter how tough things got. And that strength, it was contagious. As she made the call, I took a few steps back, running my hand through my hair, trying to get my mind back on track. The pressure was on. If we didn't fix this in time, everything we'd worked for would crumble. But I wasn't about to let it. I had one goal now: get this place standing again. And if it meant working through the night, then so be it. When Adeline hung up the phone, she walked back to me, her face set in that same determined look she'd worn since day one. "They're on their way," she said. "We can do this." I looked at her for a long moment, a strange pull tightening in my chest. There was something between us now, something I hadn't expected, but it wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about more than that. "Let's get to work," I said. We threw ourselves into the task, working like a well-oiled machine, our hands moving without words, our minds in sync. We didn't have time to waste, and I knew if we didn't get this right, we'd lose it all. As the hours wore on and the crew arrived to help, I found myself thinking about Adeline more than I should. I didn't want to. I didn't want to mix business with anything else. But every time I looked at her, I saw something more than just the woman who'd inherited Hudson Hall. I saw someone who had fought tooth and nail for every inch of this building, someone who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, who refused to give up no matter how bad things got. By the time the crew had finished, we were both exhausted, but there was no sense of relief. Not yet. The work was done, but the hardest part was still ahead of us, the inspection. I turned to her, a small smile playing at the corner of my lips. "You ready?" She met my gaze, her eyes searching mine for a second before she nodded. "Ready." And just like that, the next chapter began. The building wasn't the only thing that was being tested now, so were we. The morning of the inspection came too quickly, but there was no turning back. Hudson Hall had been restored to the best of our abilities, and now all we had to do was wait for the official verdict. We'd worked ourselves to the bone, pulling long hours, making adjustments, pushing every limit. The building stood stronger now, but there was still that heavy feeling in the air, like it could all come crashing down in an instant. I stood by the door, staring at the familiar skyline outside. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets. Adeline had arrived early, as she always did, her boots tapping quietly on the wooden floors as she walked toward me. She didn't look like someone waiting for a miracle. She looked like someone who was already prepared for whatever came next. Her back was straight, her eyes focused, but there was a weight to her silence that told me she was as nervous as I was. "You okay?" I asked, turning to face her. She glanced up at me, her gaze steady, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It was brief, but it was there, and for a moment I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching her, knowing that everything we'd worked for was on the line. "I'm fine," she said, her voice calm, though her hands betrayed her. They were folded tightly in front of her, knuckles pale. "Just nervous. I can't help it." I nodded, understanding all too well. The pressure had been building for weeks. The bank's deadline, the looming threat of losing everything. This wasn't just a building to her. It was her grandmother's legacy, her future, her dream. If we failed today, it would all come crashing down. "You've got this," I said, trying to sound confident, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. She looked at me then, her lips quirking up into the faintest smile. "So do you." And that was all we needed to say. We both knew it, even if neither of us said it aloud. We'd gotten this far together. Now we just had to let the pieces fall into place. Moments later, the door opened, and Inspector Miller walked in, followed closely by Vance, the bank representative trailing behind him like a shadow. I could feel the tension spike instantly. Vance's smile was tight, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the one he wore when he thought he had the upper hand. He was here to see us fail. "Miss Thomas." Miller greeted her, his voice gruff but professional. "Let's get started, shall we?" Adeline nodded, her back straight, her hands now at her sides, steady despite everything. The inspector made his way across the room, glancing at the structure, taking in the repairs, inspecting the work we'd done. I could see his eyes scanning every detail, but there was no way to read him yet. Vance stood by, arms crossed, his eyes cold as they flicked over the building. I could feel his presence, the pressure of his gaze weighing on me, but I refused to let it affect me. I kept my focus on the inspector, silently praying we hadn't missed anything. The hours we'd spent perfecting every beam, every joint, every bolt, it had all come down to this. Miller's hand reached out, tapping the new steel plate we'd installed across the trusses. It rang clean, the sound sharp in the silence of the room. He stepped back, his gaze lingering on the work for a moment longer before he looked up at Adeline. "Who torqued these bolts?" he asked, his tone neutral but demanding. Adeline stepped forward, her posture straight, her voice steady. "I did, with a hand ratchet. Under Sawyer's supervision. All by the book." Miller didn't respond at first, his eyes flicking to her hands, the raw spots on her palms, the faint bruises under her fingers from hours of work. He nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement before turning back to Vance. "This building is stabilized," Miller said, his voice firm. "The work is clean. The violation has been cleared. The inspection passes." I couldn't breathe for a moment. The words felt like they were moving through me slowly, but when they finally hit, they slammed into me like a freight train. It was over. We'd done it. The smile that appeared on Adeline's face then wasn't just relief. It was victory. She stood taller, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the words she'd been waiting for. Vance, on the other hand, didn't take it well. His face drained of color, and for the first time he looked like he was fighting for control. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "Impossible!" He finally spat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Miller didn't flinch. He turned on Vance, his gaze hardening. "You don't run my inspection, and you don't own this building." Vance opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. Miller's eyes were unforgiving, and with one last glance he turned away, motioning for the bank rep to follow him. The door closed behind them, and Hudson Hall, for the first time in what felt like forever, was ours again. Adeline's shoulders sagged for a split second, the weight of it all finally catching up with her. But then she turned to me, and I saw the softness in her eyes, the same eyes that had been so focused, so determined through it all. She took a deep breath, stepping closer to me. For a moment, everything felt like it had slowed down, the noise of the world outside muffled by the quiet of the hall. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't need to answer her with words. I just stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. It wasn't just about the building anymore. It wasn't about the job. It was about what we'd been through together, about the trust, the connection that had grown between us over these past weeks. When we pulled away, I found myself searching her face. She was standing so close, her breath warm against my skin, and for the first time, I didn't want to pull away. The building might have been fixed, but something else had changed between us. Something I wasn't ready to name, but that felt like it was there, hanging in the air. Adeline reached into her pocket and pulled out the check, the one I'd rejected weeks ago. But this time, when she slid it across the table, I didn't push it back. "I want you to stay," she said simply, her eyes searching mine. "For good." I picked up the check, my fingers brushing against hers. "I'll stay," I said, my voice steady, but my heart racing. "But I think there's more work to be done." She smiled then, that same smile I'd seen all those days ago, the one that made me forget everything else. "I think so too," she replied, her eyes twinkling with something I couldn't quite place. And as we stood there, surrounded by the echoes of Hudson Hall, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. And that was all that mattered. The future wasn't a countdown to collapse anymore. It was a chance to build something real, something that would last.